Hi everybody! Today I have a new plugin for you. Are you ready for a plugin that is not a mixing plugin and it's not a software instrument and it needs quite some explaining? Does that sound good? Are you curious, or does that frighten you already? The new plugin is the Midi Sequencer Notes, Drums, Control Voltage Midi Controller. Once installed, you find it under the name Sequence. And now what this thing can do: in one mode it can play MIDI sequences. In another mode it can trigger drum computers. And it can send automation data. And it can do that in two modes. The one mode is automation for parameter automation in ReaPack. And the other mode is it can send them on MIDI controllers. And now what we see, of course, is the MIDI sequence player. And this is an empty sequence. And here we have the modes, so we're in sequencer mode. We can switch that to the drum mode, but it can only be in one of these modes at once. So either MIDI sequencer or drum computer trigger. And then we have this modulation thing here. Here we can draw automation. So let's say we want to draw a sequence, and now we can draw automation. And we'll come to that later. Then we have these other two buttons here for the controller voltage. This is a controller voltage we can send out, or we can say we want to send this controller voltage to a MIDI parameter, but we'll come to all that later. Let's just begin with the drum computer trigger. And obviously it's made as we know all drum computers. So we have these different pads which contain different sounds. And I of course put them in this order. First the sequence, then the groove agent. And I set up one of these plugins now, and all I did yet was choosing the drum mode. And now what we can do, we can read that here. So left click creates an item set to the velocity for new items. So we can change a velocity for new items here. Holding Alt and clicking monitors the sound. So we can hear which is assigned here. So let's try this. We can monitor and we can create. So now we should have our kick drum on quarter notes. And of course what you saw is that the cursor is running in bar 2, and then it stops of course because I didn't set notes here in bar 2, but I also don't want to do that, so let's remove them. Command and left click or Control on Windows, Command is on Mac, deletes an item. Delete, delete, delete. And this now brings us to the other buttons here. I only want to program one bar, so I can choose how long my sequence should be. 4 bars, 2 bars, or 1 bar. 2 bars would be like this. And if we have 4 bars, we can switch to the other 2 bars here, which vanishes if I only have 2 bars. And if I only have 1 bar, this is grayed out. And above here, we have these numbers from 1 to 24, because we can store 24 sequences in there. Currently, I'm editing sequence number 2. So okay, now with a loop length of 1 bar, it should play. Okay, great. Let's do some more. Something like that. And now let's change this a bit. So maybe put one here, remove this one, put another one here. And now let's switch to the sequence number 1. I have prepared a little sequence in the slot number 1 here. And now if I hit play, we still hear sequence number 2 because this sequence is not active. Sequence active, and now we should hear this sequence number 1. Oh wait, do I hear another sound? Yes, I do hear another sound, because we have only 8 notes we can trigger here, but we have 16 pads, so we can go to the higher pads, and here we see I triggered this tone. Okay, let's again go to the lower pads. And by the way, if your drum computer plugin uses different MIDI keys to trigger the notes, you can change them here for each of the trigger lanes. And of course, you don't have to do that every time you use the plugin. You can just create a preset for that, press the plus button, save preset, and type in a name for the particular drum computer you want to control. Okay, now let's take a closer look at this text here. So we had this creating items, we had this left click for monitoring, and now right click for moving items. I right click, and I can move it. When I now press Shift and right click, I can move the whole lane. And now let's see the next one. Shift and drag changes the velocity. And of course, Control or Command and left click is deleting items. We had that before, and we saw the changing of the mapping. Now let's see this shuffle thing here. Let's create some more notes, which are on this 16th, and maybe make the project a bit slower. And now if I hit play, it's of course what we see, but slow. And now I can turn up the shuffle feel, so the kind of swing sound. Okay, let's see some things we didn't see. Sequences, we can select the loop length, the shuffle, we can activate the sequence, and here we have this trigger mode. So if I click here, trigger select, it says press key. And now I press a low C on my keyboard. And now, as we can see, every time I press the low key on my keyboard, the sequence is active. And now let's select the D key for the second sequence. And now if I hit play, I can trigger the sequences during the playback. Okay, let's make that faster again. And of course, we can not only trigger this from our keyboard during playback, we can record a sequence for that. So, for example, see, with a little click. Now, here we have our sequence. We can cut this in place and of course duplicate it, and it will play what we would expect. And so on. So now I hope you see how it makes sense that we can store up to 24 sequences. My idea was that we can program the sequences and then fire them just from keys in the Midi editor. And now let's see the last buttons on the right side. Because if you have a loop that is longer than 1 bar, it matters how your offset of the song relates to the start position of the ReaPack project. And so you can select your offset here. 0 bars, 1 bar, 2 bar, or 3 bars. So that's basically it about the drum computer. Let's see in the sequence number 3. Let's briefly repeat. We can select the velocity we want to initially set. We can click and create some items here. And if we have more than 2 bars, we can switch to 3 and 4 here. And go back. And if we want to trigger the higher pads of our drum computers, we go to high. And we can click here and trigger the higher pads. Now for the MIDI sequencer part, let's add another track. So we can close this one here and add another track. Record ready this. And now let's insert a synthesizer. Of course, we're using the WTFM synthesizer here. And maybe already choose a preset. For this demonstration, Don't Kazoo can be good. So now I can play that on my MIDI keyboard. And now let's add the sequence. And of course we want to put this before the synthesizer so it can send the MIDI out to the synthesizer. And now maybe let's start again with simple quarter notes. Note, 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 note. And let's say we have 2 bars length. And now when I hit play, it doesn't play anything, because it always plays what you play on the keyboard. So in a way, this is a kind of a relative sequence. So the note that you refer to is always this middle C. Even if you play an A on the keyboard, it will play an A if this middle C is triggered. So basically on the keyboard you select the root key in which this sequence is played then. And as you just saw, you can also play polyphonic stuff on the keyboard, and this will lead to multiple notes at once that are of course played. So let's see what is written down there. Click to create a note, and with Shift we can create and drag, something like this. And let's see the last line. Control is just as in the drum computer, we can delete the notes. With scrolling on the note, we can change the note length, and it will only be to the next note that is played, because the sequences are always monophonic. Now let's create some more notes here. So we have 8th notes. Okay, that's boring. Let's see what we can do about the velocity. So if I go down here, the text changes that we can read. Click and drag is changing the velocity. If you hold Alt, it will change the velocity +10. And Alt and Shift will subtract 10. You can also scroll on the velocity to change it. And of course, with Shift only, you can fine-tune the velocity. Now, let's add some more. I'm first erasing all to then create a full line here. Okay, these are, I need to switch them to the same octave here. Now we have boring 16th notes. And now let's use this, what we can read down there. Alt is +1 octave and Alt Shift is -1 octave. So I hold Alt and Shift and click, and it goes down 1 octave. And when I now only hold Alt and click, it goes up an octave. Let's do that a couple of times. And oh, I made a mistake, you see that? But let's hear how it sounds. Now that's beginning to be more fun. Let me quickly change this here. So now I just change it so it looks like I wanted it to be. And now our sequence can sound like this. And now what we saw is that we need an offset of 1 bar. And now I want to do another thing. I shift that last note an octave up and another octave up. And of course we can have more than these 2 octaves here. We can just scroll and then set this somewhere else. Maybe here, and have it a bit longer. And now let's hear it again. And of course now we could play with the velocities here. For that we would need a velocity sensitive synthesizer. So we go in the synthesizer, right click, and do something like this and this and this. So now it's velocity sensitive. Now it sounds a lot more like a sequence. And of course we can do all this stuff we could do with the drums too. So we could give it a shuffle. Actually not too bad. Okay, and we can store up to 24 sequences in the Midi sequencer as well. We can do this trigger stuff too. And now how it works is, the Midi notes that are used to trigger are not played as a sequence, and vice versa. So the Midi notes that are not used as a trigger will be played back as a sequence. I click here and it says press key, and let's say I use this C sharp, and now it will only play if I hit this C sharp. And of course with this method, just as with a drum computer, you can trigger the different sequences here. Let's choose sequence number 2. And you see the sequence number 1 is displayed as a shadow here. So maybe we just do something like this and say it's 1 bar long, and we select another trigger, D sharp. And now let's see what happens. So you can not only select which sequence is played, but you can also play several sequences at once. For example, if you want to use polyphonic stuff, you need more than one sequence for that. Then you could set the triggers to all the same key to trigger all the sequences together. And now here we have one button more, and this is the button Grid Triplets. Because in the mode we can select up to 16th notes in different length and pitch and all that stuff. And we can select to shuffle our grid. But if we actually need triplets in our grid, we can select Grid Triplets. Pitifully, this will lead to loss of the data you have there. So maybe choose an empty sequence if you don't want to lose your sequence. And as you now see, we have a triplet grid. So we can even do faster stuff. And of course, what you do in this plugin is completely independent to what synthesizer you put after this. So this doesn't need to be the WTFM synthesizer. You could choose whatever synthesizer you like, but the WTFM synthesizer has some benefits together with this plugin. We come to that soon. But for example, let's use this sequence again and change the patch here, maybe to Acid Silver, which is a kind of a house-based synthesizer. Well, that sounds familiar, I think, because we could change the sound in the synthesizer. And so on. Well, I think that's basically it about the MIDI sequencer part. And now let's see the modulation part. And for demonstration, let's use another track here. And of course, we want to insert the plugin. And we need another plugin to show you what it's doing. And this time it's not about sound, it's about you can see what I'm doing. So I need something that is really visible. So we choose the aux mixer series 2 this time. So here's my aux mixer, And now I want to control this from the sequencer. Let's pop that out too. So in the sequencer, let's go to the modulator. And here we have an empty sequence. So it's off, it's doing nothing. Of course, as we had before, we can have up to 24 sequences. And each sequence can have a bar offset from the project. But hey, I'm not telling you something new here. So let's put that to maybe a sine. Now we have a sequence with a sine wave. And the sequence is 4 bars long. And now we can choose how many of these sine waves we want to fit in these 4 bars. Now maybe let's choose another sequence, sequence number 2, and put that to square and give them some more. And now in order to control something like this fader here, we need a link between the 2 plugins. And this is what I would call a control voltage. So we go to the CV control voltage tab. And here now we can select the modulator, which is sequence number 1. I could change that to sequence number 2, but let's use sequence number 1. Now our control voltage number 1 will be this sine wave. And now we move this fader here, go to parameters, parameter modulation, and now link from another effects parameter. We choose the sequence CV slider number 1. And now this should move this fader. And now it's not doing what we expect. We want it to go up and down all the way. And that's because of this slider here. Now it's following what I put in here. This way of connecting plugins with the controller voltage might look a bit tricky at the first glance. But once you did it a couple of times, well, you get used to that. And by the way, the WTFM synthesizer automatically picks up the controller voltages. So you don't have to do anything to connect the plugins, but we'll come to that in a minute. Okay, now back to what we had. We have the fader going up and down and up and down. And of course, when we go back to the modulation tab and the sequence we selected there, we can make it faster or slower. And we can select another shape. And so on. Now let's go back to this controller voltage tab and see what we have here. We have the modulation sequence, which we selected is number 1, is this triangle we just did. And I can select a multiplier. And now I can multiply with sequence 2. And now that's giving us a funny shape. Because, going back here, sequence 2 does this. So it says, do what sequence 1 does. Go back to 0. Do what sequence 1 does. Go back to 0, and so on. And of course you can modulate with whatever you want. So for example, let's choose a saw wave and let's do that very slow. And now our controller voltage looks differently. Okay, let's switch off this modulator again. So we only have what sequence number 1 does is on controller voltage number 1. And in sequence number 1, we do something different. So we could have this square and triangle and sawtooth and sine wave, just as we know it from synthesizers. Of course, we can turn that off and we can put that to sequence. And here we can draw our own sequence. Just click here to create some nodes. And then you can put them wherever you want. And with scrolling on a node, you can change the shape. And you can even right click here and put that to hold. And now it holds until the next node appears. And this is now a curve, which we see here, it's a curve. And we can do that, switch that back to a fade. So it will be linear. Let's see the movement of the fader down here with this sequence. and the T sequence is just with the triplet grid. Now we know how to draw a sequence or automatically draw a sequence. We can go further to the controller voltage tab again. So let's repeat this. I selected this the modulation sequence number 1 on the controller voltage number 1. So it does what I just input there. And this is the modifier for that. Let's see that again. So the blue line is the modifier for the green line, and the white line is the resulting curve. Let's again change this here and maybe give it an offset. So I think you get an idea what this does. Let's switch that off again so we can see the other things we can do here. So for this controller voltage, we can choose an offset from the original curve. And we can scale that. And this brings us to these options absolute, where we can scale where you see, and centered will scale in both directions. Now we had a little jump in the video because I had to do a little editing. For the trigger key selection, also in the other modes, you have to have this record enabled here. So okay, let's see what we can do with the trigger stuff. Before we had this CV state, static or active. So active is what we had before. Static is the value you can choose at the static value here. And now I can switch on trigger mode. And just as with the other modes, I can click here and select a key. Let's say G sharp. And now only when I press G sharp, the sequence will be active. And if I don't press it, it will be static. So now let's see how that works together with the synthesizer. So here we have what we had before. We had the sequence here and we had our preset loaded here. And remember, we had to press C sharp to let it play the sequence number 1, and it will play which note we play additionally to C sharp. Let's do that again. And now let's make a modulation. Modulation, sequence number 1. Maybe do some simple stuff. So we choose a sawtooth, we make it slow. And now let's assign this to the controller voltage. So this is selected, number 1 by default, and it's just active, so we don't need to trigger that with a key. And now let's go over to the synthesizer plugin. And this WTFM synthesizer automatically picks up all the controller voltages. So if I right click for the modulation view, and let's say I want to modulate the cutoff frequency, I say not to wheel, not to aftertouch. So this would be wheel, aftertouch, or just modulating whatever comes in there. And now we choose controller voltage number 1. And now our cutoff should rise with this sawtooth here. What it does. Let's make this more obvious. So let's take the baseline value down and go again in the modulation view and give this more offset. So now this should be more obvious. Of course, you can automate whatever you want. For example, if we wanted to edit the volume of this oscillator here, we could do this with another controller voltage and assign another shape here to the other controller voltage and so on. Now let's give this some more offset again, something like this maybe. And now let's use a trigger for this. So select, and this time we use the C sharp 1 octave higher. Let's turn the static value to 0. And only if I press the C sharp, it will be on, and else it will be off. And now let's see what happened. Now the static value is a bit low. Let's see what makes sense. Something like that. This plugin here particularly automatically picks up the controller voltage lanes here. If you don't have this, you need to connect the plugins. So let's use another plugin now. So now here I have the Tukan Poly G plugin, and I set this up with this sound now. And now when I let it play the sequence, it can sound like this. And now let's assign this controller voltage thing there. So let's take the cutoff frequency again, move this knob, parameters, modulation link, baseline is here, link from another FX parameter, choose the sequencer, CV slider number 1, and now we should see how it moves. Now, of course, many synthesizer plugins, as well as hardware synthesizers, have their modulation controlled from Midi sources. Let me give you an example. We can go to the cheat mode. And here we could control things from the pitch wheel or from the modulation wheel. And this brings us to this last page here, the Midi page. And here we have all the fancy controllers. So let's say we want to use modulation from the pitch wheel. We click here and choose which of the CVs we want to send to the pitch wheel. Or this continuous controller number 1, modulation, we could say modulation comes from here. And now let's set up some funny modulation stuff. Let's modulate the oscillators. And now let's hear what we get. And I guess the synthesizer lovers among you will find out how to use this Midi sending stuff there. And maybe for the ending of this video, a little tip here. And this is that this plugin can not only be used to control modulation for synthesizers, but as we had before, you can send these data to faders and all kinds of controls of mixing plugins. And then with this static thing here, you can adjust where your value should be. And if you need repeating automation stuff, you can just fire that from this plugin into whatever you want. Equalizer plugin, chorus plugin, compressor plugin, or whatever you like. So, well, I hope you like this stuff, and I hope you have fun with this plugin, have fun with all the other plugins, and bye bye.